I'm the CTO of Addresscloud. And I'm going to be talking to you today about some work that we're doing to use the H3 geospatial index for our risk assessments of addresses. I have a background in geospatial engineering applied to urban risk. And as I said, I'm the CTO of Addresscloud. Addresscloud is a company that was founded in 2015 and provides geocoding, property intelligence, and risk assessments to businesses and companies in the insurance and financial and logistics sectors. We work with a range of companies from startups to FTSE 100 businesses. So just select the next slide. Here we go. So today's presentation is going to be in two parts. I want to talk about why addresses are really key to connecting property and risk, because I think the conversation around geocoding and addresses as a sort of central facet of geographic data is one that's important to have. And then I'm going to look at how we're using the H3 index to solve some of the challenges that we found with addressing. So I wanted to start the presentation with this map that was published in the New York Times recently that shows the spatial variability of extreme weather events across the United States as a result of climate change. The map shows that we can see an increasing prevalence of wildfires on the west coast in California, whereas the east coast and the eastern seaboard is going to be more affected by hurricanes and extreme rainfall. Now, this is the kind of information that our customers in the insurance sector and in the lending sector are increasingly asking us for. They want to know the risk to a property, not only in the here and now, but in the future. They want to know what the risks of those geographic perils are going to be over a 30-year time span. So it's quite an interesting challenge to serve up that data at the property level to our customers. One thing to bear in mind, of course, is that not everybody thinks spatially. I realize that that's quite a risky thing to say at a spatial data science conference, but really addresses are the key to geographic risk. And what I mean by that is that at the beginning of an insurance journey or of a lending journey, for example, applying for a mortgage application for a house, everything starts with an address. So here I've got a made-up address from Boston in the United States, and we can now work through how that address is used in an underwriting process for an insurer, for example. So the first thing to understand is, where is that risk? So where is that address? We can locate it on the Earth's surface. Once we understand where it is, we can understand what it is. Is that an address, an apartment building? Is it a commercial premises? Or is it an individual house? Once an insurer understands what the risk is, then they can start to understand what the rebuild costs would be. So if, in the case of a catastrophic event, what they would have to pay out to completely rebuild that property. When we know where the risk is and what the risk is, we can understand what perils may affect that risk. So is that house susceptible to flooding or to subsidence or to wildfire? And also insurers in particular like to know how they're exposed. So they need to know almost in real time what other risks they have on cover in the neighborhood. So if there is a localized catastrophic event, they can understand what they're going to be on cover for across that whole neighborhood, not just at the individual property level. So behind the scenes, there's some fairly standard spatial processes going on. Those of you that have joined us today that are working in the GIS sector will have heard of most of these. We've got some geocoding going on to take our address to a location. We've got some property intelligence lookups to tell us about that property. And we've got some perils analysis where we're looking at those spatial models, both in the here and now and in the future, to understand the risks to that property. And we're looking at exposure management, so aggregation of data spatially in real time to understand our exposure. Those of you that's worked with addressing understand that there's a number of nuances, and it's important to me to sort of convey these because this is really what pushed us on to start to look at alternate spatial indexing strategies for our addressing data sets. We've got multiple addresses in one location. So in an apartment building, all of those addresses might be slightly different for 6 different apartments, but those addresses will all be within the same building footprint. We've got a multiple address databases. Our customers may like to see addresses from different databases for different purposes. They may be stored slightly differently in different formats. They may have slightly different locations. So we need to be able to deal with that. But we need to be able to recognize that those are all the same address at the same location. And also, address identifiers and locations are transient. What I mean by that is that throughout the life cycle of a building, the identifier for an address or for a property may change. We may also see the centroid of the property change, particularly if there's a use change there from, for example, commercial to residential. But that's what we do. That's our job, is to take addresses and convert them into intelligence. And at Addresscloud, we do that every day. We have hundreds of people logging onto our system to look at our maps to understand how risky a given property is. And these are the technical challenges with that system that keep me awake at night, and these are the things that I'm responsible for kind of dealing with. I've already said that addresses change and move. Here in the United Kingdom, the post office, which is responsible for delivering the post, but the Royal Mail also is responsible for addressing, and they will release somewhere between 200 and 500 address changes to the national address database every day. So that's thousands of address databases churning through our database every month, and we need to keep on top of those changes. Obviously, we've got these amazing spatial data sets that tell us about our geographic risk in the background of our service, but the spatial joins of those data sets are expensive. And we've seen some brilliant examples from earlier presentations where people are starting to look at global and national scale data sets and be able to perform those joins on the fly, which is fantastic. We obviously are interested in the way that we can do that as efficiently as possible, because potentially we have to do that at the national scale every day as our data sets change. And also, when we're aggregating our spatial data, if we use an arbitrary boundary or an arbitrary polygon set, such as a postcode, then we'll get the modifiable aerial unit problem, which is a fairly well known problem in spatial data science, which means that we see artifacts in our data that aren't a function of the data, they're just a function of the postcode boundaries that we've chosen to use for our aggregation. So could hexagons be the answer? And this is a question at Addresscloud that we started to ask ourselves a couple of years ago now, and it's been an ongoing conversation. So the H3 Geospatial Index is a spatial index that has been released as open source technology by Uber, and it's a tessellating set of hexagons that covers the entire surface of the Earth. And each hexagon has a nested hierarchical structure. And simply put, what that means is that for every hexagon, there's a set of smaller hexagons that sit approximately within the bigger hexagon. So as you zoom in and out of the map, you can see smaller and bigger hexagons. And for every hexagon that we have on the Earth's surface, we get a unique identifier, which is great because we have a set of consistent tessellating cells across the entire surface of the Earth at different scales that have a unique identifier. So the way that we've started to apply that technology and kind of get some lever the H3 index for some success is that we snap all of our locations in our geocoding databases to the H3 cell that they sit within. And that gives us an immutable location for every address. It's quite interesting to note that throughout the life cycle of an address, we may see the location of the address from our data providers move. So as the outline of the building is updated, sometimes we see that address point move, and we have to kind of keep on top of those changes. Whereas in this kind of scenario, we're saying, okay, we've got an address, we know where it is, let's assign it a cell index. So by doing that, not only do we make things a little bit more efficient, but we also reduce data volume because we can share that cell against all of the multiple addresses that may exist at that address. If you think back to the apartment building example that I showed, we've got 6 addresses that are all in the same building footprint, or all in the same location, effectively on top of each other. They can now share that cell index. What does that mean? Well, it means that indexing our geographic data is faster and more efficient. We reckon we've reduced our problem space somewhere between 20 and 40% because we're not having to store the very similar sets of geographic data or coordinates for every address. We simply say we've got one H3 cell and its geography, and we're attributing that to 6 or more addresses in that apartment building. At the same time, we can also leverage the H3 index one further by using it to index our other spatial data sets. So we've got our property attribute information that tells us whether this is an apartment building or a house or a commercial property or a fire station. And we've also got our geographic perils data. So we've got this really high resolution set of data outputs from our brilliant data partners that are showing us things like flood risk, both in the here and now and in the future against a range of different climate change scenarios. So really big, spatially, temporally dense sets of data that we're having to deal with. What we've started to do now is index all of those data sets as well by the same H3 cell index. So that means that we can very quickly say, okay, here's an address. We know which cell it resides within. What else do I know about that cell? And that lookup process is very quick and is very efficient. One of the things that we try to do at Addresscloud, and the key is kind of in the name, is that we try to do everything in the cloud. So we take our data sets and we try to push them up into the cloud to get them as close to our users as possible. Lots of our customers are consuming this data in real time to power their websites. So when you come to get an insurance quote, you may actually be looking up an address against Addresscloud and maybe giving that information back to a customer to work out how risky or not a property is. So we need to be able to return all this information to our customers within a couple of 100 milliseconds. And so what we can do now is we've got this brilliant indexing scheme. We've pre-processed our data to say these things are all linked using this H3 cell ID, which is this point in space that's not moving. So we can take all of our spatial data sets out of our spatial database and push them up into the cloud. And what that means is we can now use a non-spatial database to store those attributes and that information as close to our users as possible, so that when they perform that lookup, it's very, very fast. And lastly, I already kind of mentioned at the beginning that the H3 index is hierarchically nested. So as you zoom in, for every big hexagon, you get a set of smaller hexagons inside it. It's kind of like a Russian doll scenario. And that means we can have aggregation on our data out of the box. Here's an example from the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, I didn't have an example for the US on record, but what we're doing here is we're saying we've got a simulated book of all the properties on cover for one of our customers, showing the total sums insured against flood risk for the United Kingdom. And we're able to aggregate and disaggregate that data on the fly. And what that means is now that our customers can start to say, hey, where have we got high pockets of risk? Where we may need to have some business intervention to understand that it's not good to have that much risk in one area. And we can see that this is going to be applied across multiple different sectors now, because obviously the H3 index allows us to aggregate lots of different types of data, not just policy insurance, which is seen in this example. And we get that lovely consistent visualization. This is just being run locally on a laptop, which is amazing. All of these thousands, in fact, hundreds of thousands of data points being aggregated and disaggregated on the fly. So I've kept to time, which has been amazing. I can see I've got sort of 4 key point summary for you. Addresses connect property and risk. I think this is an important point and something which is sort of stepped over in our excitement as spatial data scientists for some of these amazing new addressing data sets. We need to think about how we connect them back to the real world for people who don't think spatially. And addressing is one way to do that and one very efficient way to do that. H3 index makes that process even more efficient because it gives us a consistent location for every address. We can join on that data without a spatial query in effect. And we can use that hierarchy out of the box to aggregate and disaggregate over large areas. So I hope that's been useful and of interest. Thanks very much for joining me. And I'm happy to take questions now in the conversation, or feel free to drop me an email. Thanks very much.
Hi, Tomas. Thank you very much for your presentation. We have got some great questions in the chat here. The first of which is from James David Smith, who's asked, what benefits does a hexagon and sub-hexagon system have over, say, a regular gridded system? It seems a gridded system would give the same functionality.
Yeah, it's the tessellation of the hexagons. So with a regular gridded system with a map projection, we see that the shape of that grid cell is most likely to change depending on where you are on the Earth's surface. The nice thing about the H3 system is that those hexagons are almost the same size and shape at every point on the Earth's surface. So when you do those kind of national scale aggregations and disaggregations, you don't get these weird artifacts where you've got bigger boxes towards the poles and smaller boxes kind of nearer the equator. The hexagons are kind of spatially consistent.
Fantastic. Somebody on the chat as well has actually recommended Uber's presentation on their H3 grid system, and actually, we had one of the team join last year's conference. So if you check out last year's playlist, if you're interested, that might give you some answers as well.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend all of their content. Is how we learned about it and started using it.
Brilliant. Fantastic. There's also a question here from Nico de Graaf, who says, hexagons cannot be perfectly subdivided at different hierarchy levels. How do you deal with uncertainties in grouping results?
In effect, we don't. So yeah, you're correct. You're absolutely correct. When you subdivide your hexagon into smaller hexagons, there's little sliver polygons that exist where you don't quite get all of your hexagons to fit within the parent hexagon. It's just not something that it's an artifact of the way that system works, but it's not something that we worry about, because we're effectively kind of snapping into that hexagon. So we're saying, does this point reside within this hexagon? Yeah, okay, so it gets assigned that attribute. And then when we scale up, the H3 system is just saying the majority of all of these hexagons is within this parent hexagon. So we just take them in. So it's not counted twice. There's no double counting. We're working at kind of a 5 meter to building scale resolution. So it's, in terms of data volumes, it's very high and it's quite precise, but it's not kind of survey grade where we're saying this is precisely the front door. That's not our use case. So we the levels of the hexagons come at different levels. The levels that we work, we find it's a trade-off between efficiency and precision, and we haven't had any problems.
Fantastic. Okay, Tomas, I'm going to have to stop there on the questions, but there are some more in the chat. If you could take them on the chat, that would be brilliant. And now we're going to, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hopefully see you at next year's conference.